pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Cosma. Chris got his bachelor's in ecology and evolution at UC Santa Barbara. And when I asked him just beforehand, as some of you heard, what he had done in the way of research, it turns out he did a lot of different things. He sort of was finding his way, I guess. So it was everything from aquatic plant ecology to large mammal tracking. But then he participated in the UC Study Abroad program in Costa Rica, the program in tropical ecology and conservation, and that was where he got into moth pollination. And that has led him to the University of California at Riverside, where he's doing his PhD now. He's given multiple talks, including to the California Native Plant Society, conservation groups, Entomological Society of America, and in the UC Riverside Grad Fest in 2022, he won the best talk with the title, "Without the Caterpillar, You Don't Get the Butterfly." So I asked Chris what he enjoys doing other than playing around with moths. And well, actually, other than his research, I should say, because the first thing he actually said was he was light trapping moths in Baja, California. And he is also converting his yard to permaculture garden using principles of agroecology, including native plants, which sounds like it might be another great talk, actually. But also he does have one super interesting and unusual hobby, which is called pyrography, which is wood burning. So he made these two medallions, and I'm willing to bet that he will take commissions. So if anybody wants an insect on a pendant of an insect. And so with no further ado, let me hand this over to Chris, and he will share his research on using native plants to help conserve Lepidoptera and pollinators.
All right, well, thank you, Amy, for that very thorough introduction. I don't think I'm quite good enough to be taking commissions for my wood burning, but if you're interested, you can let me know. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Can everyone hear me and see my screen all right? All right, I see a thumbs up. All right, so yeah, thanks again, Amy, and thanks for having me here. Thanks everyone for tuning in. So yeah, this talk is about prioritizing California native plants for butterfly and moth conservation. Like Amy said, my name's Chris Cosma. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in Nicole Rafferty's lab in the Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology department here at UC Riverside. And most of my research does focus on how climate change is affecting moths and their interactions with plants. But I do want to begin this talk today with a species that I suspect everyone is familiar with, and that is the monarch butterfly. So you may be aware that just about 3.5 months ago, the IUCN officially added the migratory monarch butterfly to its red list and classified it as an endangered species. In 2020, the Western monarch Thanksgiving count, which tallies the population that overwinters here in California, had recorded fewer than 2,000 individual monarchs. And so here in this graph, we see in the green bars, the population trend through the years. And this 2020 plummet actually represented an over 99% decline in this population since about the 1980s. And so I do study moths, but I'm not a butterfly hater. You know, like many of you, I've been learning about the monarch butterfly since I was a child. So this hit me really hard, this decision to list this species as endangered. But like all of the charismatic species that we study today, the monarch butterfly is a poster child for a much larger problem. So right here in the US, about 48% of butterfly species that have been assessed by Crossley et al. 2021 are in decline. So that's over 200 species of butterflies just here in the United States. And those declines are the most apparent in the Southwest and other parts of the Western United States. So here is a heat map from this paper where the warmer colors here are showing the higher rates of decline in butterfly abundance. And so we can see here in the red in the Southwest that, butterflies are declining by almost 2% a year in some of these areas. And some work by Matt Forster at UNR has shown that butterfly abundance has been declining by about 1.6% per year in the Western US on average over the last 4 decades. And really critically, they've found that dozens of species are even more at risk than the monarch butterfly, including very widespread species like the West Coast lady that's pictured here. So taking a step back, there are about 240 butterfly species in California, and we know that their populations are declining right now. But like I said, I'm a moth guy, so I'm going to be talking a lot about moths today as well. And so what about the around 5,000 moth species that we have just in California alone? Well, the answer is we don't really know how they're doing because unlike butterflies, no one's really analyzed their long-term population trends. But we do have comprehensive data sets from other parts of the world, including in Britain, where they found a 33% decline in moth abundance since 1968. So just over the past 50 years or so. And so here's that, that downward trend through the years, and one of their study species, the Sussex emerald. All right, so the first part of this talk is going to have a lot of pretty depressing news, and I do apologize for that, but I promise I'm going to get into the hopeful stuff in the second half of this talk. So, Lepidoptera are declining. We know that globally, we know that right here in the Western US. Why does that matter? Well, one of the reasons we care about Lepidoptera declines is that the insect order Lepidoptera, which includes both butterflies and moths, is the second most diverse group of insects that we know of. There are over 14,000 Lepidoptera species in North America alone, and 95% of the species in the order Lepidoptera are actually moths and not butterflies. So the vast majority of Lepidoptera diversity are moths, and really only a small subset of Lepidoptera here in the highlighted region are our small subset of butterflies here. And there's a joke amongst people that study Lepidoptera that butterflies are really just day-flying moths. So they're super diverse, but we also know that Lepidoptera play critical roles in ecosystems. So as larvae, as caterpillars, Lepidoptera are herbivores, taking in that plant energy. And in their larval stage and also in their adult stage, they're a really critical food source for a lot of different animals, including birds and bats. And in these two roles as herbivores and as prey, Lepidoptera actually transfer more energy from plants to other animals than all other herbivores combined. So again, they're critical components of our food webs. And they do this better than any other group of organisms. So caterpillars can actually make up to 90% of the diet of some of our native songbirds. And so this is some of the work of Doug Ptolemy. If you haven't checked out the work of Doug Ptolemy, I would highly recommend it. A lot of my own research is inspired by his work. And we also know that some bats are moth specialists, meaning that they pretty much exclusively rely on moths for their food source. So in light of these facts, it's really no surprise that Lepidoptera declines, including here in the United States, have been linked to declines in native songbirds and bats. So again, a study by Doug Ptolemy showed that insectivorous birds, so birds that mainly rely on insects in their diet, have declined by 2.9 billion individuals over the last 50 years. Now, in contrast to that, non-insectivorous birds, so birds that predominantly eat seeds or other food sources, have actually increased by 26.2 million individuals. So this is pretty compelling evidence that these bird declines are linked to a decline in their food source, which is predominantly insects, and the majority of those insects being caterpillars. All right, so another thing we know about Lepidoptera are that they're pollinators, and butterflies get most of the attention here. So most of us are aware that butterflies are out there during the day, flying around, visiting our plants, transferring pollen from flower to flower. But there's growing evidence, including from my own research, that moths are actually probably better pollinators than butterflies, including of both wild and agricultural plants. And so here in California, we have a lot of really great examples of moth pollination of our native plants, including hawk moth pollination of Datura, which you're seeing here in this picture. So Lepidoptera are super diverse. They're critical components of food webs, and they're also important pollinators. So we want to protect these services that humans in part rely on. And doing that requires understanding why they have been so impacted by global change. And it turns out that this is actually a really complicated question to answer. In 2021, David Wagner described the global threats to insects as death by 1,000 cuts. And this is the idea that insects are being affected on all sides by all sorts of different stressors. And these things include habitat loss, so deforestation and other ways that we clear native habitat. Introduced species, which are affecting our native insects as well as the plants that they rely on. We have pollution in its many forms, including light pollution, which is really bad for nocturnal organisms like moths. We have pesticide use in our agricultural fields, but even the herbicides and other pesticides that we spray around our own houses. And then, of course, we have the myriad effects of climate change. And I do want to focus in on climate change here because that heat map that I showed you earlier, in this same study, they've shown that these butterfly declines can in part be explained by recent climate change in these areas. So especially in the red areas, again, in the Southwest and other parts of the West, we know that it's becoming a lot hotter and drier because of climate change. And in this same study, so the bottom two panels here, panel B and panel C, they've correlated this species abundance trend, so negative numbers being a decline in butterfly abundance, with precipitation in panel B and temperature in panel C. So we see a decline in butterflies with low precipitation as well as with high temperature. And again, that's exactly what we're seeing in most parts of the world, especially here in the Southwest, where it's becoming much hotter and drier. So in summary, Lepidoptera are being affected on all sides by all of these different stressors, just like bees and other groups of insects and other organisms are as well. But one thing that we know, especially about Lepidoptera, is that they have these really close dependencies on native plant species. And the monarch butterfly milkweed relationship has taught us this. And so the monarch butterfly is what we call a host plant specialist. And that means that its caterpillars can exclusively develop on milkweed plants. It's the only plant that they can pallet. And there's evidence suggesting that specialist species are at greater risk of extinction under environmental change, in part because they're more easily decoupled from these native plant resources. So I'm going to go through a quick example of that here. Let's say on the other side of the spectrum, we have an ecological generalist. And a generalist is just a species that can rely on all sorts of different interaction partners. In the case of caterpillars using host plants, it could be a caterpillar that can rely on a dozen different host plant species. Now, the local loss or extinction of any one of those plant species is not likely to greatly affect the ecological generalist because, again, it can rely on any one of these alternative interaction partners. But that same plant species loss, when we look at an ecological specialist like our monarch butterfly, is likely to have a really negative effect because it's the only plant species it can rely on. And the monarch butterfly is not alone in its host plant specialization. In fact, 90% of plant-eating insects are host plant specialists. And what that means is that they usually can only rely on a certain lineage of plants. So monarch butterflies can pretty much eat any species of milkweed plant. Some are better than others. But sometimes this literally means that one species of Lepidoptera can only eat one plant species. So that's, extreme specialization. And usually also this means specialization on native plants. So this is a really key point here. Due to shared coevolutionary histories between native plants and native insects, those millions of years of developing alongside one another and fine-tuning these ecological interactions have created these conditions in which native insects rely very heavily on native plant species. And so I've been talking a lot about host plants. So those plants that caterpillars eat in their for the energy that they need to develop into adult butterflies and moths. But something about Lepidoptera, which may put them at even greater risk, and this is a really key point here, is that they rely on native plant resources at each stage of their complex life cycle. So we're going to review here the Lepidoptera life cycle. I know this is going to be review for most people. And this is going to be showing pictures of the monarch butterfly, but remember that this applies to most of our native butterfly and moth species. So our eggs are deposited on native host plants. Here we have some monarch eggs on milkweed. Again, caterpillars are highly specialized on their native host plants, often only able to eat those plant species. Even things like chrysalis and cocoon placement benefits from diverse native plant resources. And then finally, adults drink flower nectar. So our adult butterflies and moths visit those flowers for nectar and in turn help pollinate those plants. And there's been studies showing that native plants are often more attractive to them and also more nourishing, meaning that they're often gaining better nutritional content from these native plant species. So by looking just at the main resource use life stages here are caterpillar and our adult, it becomes very clear that Lepidoptera need both their native host plants and their native nectar plants. So again, our host plants are those plants eaten by our larval Lepidoptera, their caterpillars, and our nectar plants are those plants that are visited and often pollinated by adult Lepidoptera. And so it's really no surprise that Lepidoptera declines, including right here in California, have been linked to the loss of native hosts and nectar plants due to things like habitat destruction, climate change, and all those other factors that I talked about. All right, so hopefully that is the end of most of the more depressing news here. So let's get into what we can do about this. So these are some really major issues that are affecting our ecosystems, affecting our species, and in turn affecting humans. But there are things that we can do about it. There are things that everyone, you and I, can do about it in our very own backyards. And we know from the monarch example that part of the solution is planting native plants. So again, due to those tight coevolutionary histories, native plants support up to 15 times more native Lepidoptera species than introduced and ornamental plants. And in the context of climate change, we also know that increasing the extent and connectivity of diverse native habitat is really critical for ensuring that our ecosystems remain resilient to climate change. And so that's why we see a lot of focus on things like habitat corridors that are maintaining that connectivity in our disrupted landscapes here. So connecting, habitats across roads. And increasingly in habitats and landscapes that look something like this, what that means is using any amount of land that we have available to us. And so any yard or garden really can be an important insect waste station. There's been studies showing in the case of the monarch that milkweed gardens on private lands can contribute to effective monarch conservation. So you see signs like this, save the monarch, grow milkweeds. And here, this picture that you've probably been seeing a lot is actually a monarch on a milkweed patch that I planted just in a pot on my patio, and that attracted these monarchs, and they did have some larvae develop on these plants. All right, so especially to audience like this, when I give this talk, I know I'm preaching to the choir here about the importance of native plants, especially, you know, the importance of native plants for native insects. But I do think that we can all improve the way that we plant native for insect conservation. I'm going to explain what I mean by that here. So, you know, the monarch is at risk, so we plant milkweed, and you know, a lot of people contribute to this effort, and it's really great. And I'm going to show you at the end of this talk how effective these efforts can be. But again, the monarch is not the only species that's at risk here. And as the list of Lepidoptera species that are at risk grows larger and larger, the list of native plants that we need to support them also grows. And so effective Lepidoptera conservation requires moving from this restricted focus on individual species and interactions to considering entire communities of threatened Lepidoptera, because entire communities of Lepidoptera are threatened. And so one of the ways that we can do that is by looking at ecological networks. And this is the framework that I use in most of my research. Ecological networks just describe the interactions between entire communities of plants and entire communities of insects. So in the case of host plant interactions, we have an entire community of our caterpillars and the native plants that they rely on for host plants. And analyzing these sorts of networks can help us identify species that are most important to prioritizing conservation efforts. And this can include, again, our specialist insects that are more at risk, like our monarch butterfly. But this could also mean protecting our generalist plant species that, you know, are doing more of the work out there, supporting many different insects in the community. So in order to advance Lepidoptera conservation in California, I've created a web application called the Butterfly Net. And this is at present an R-Shiny app. So you can access it from this web address here. And I'll also go ahead and drop it in the chat. Actually, my chat is not showing up, which is weird. All right, I won't drop it in the chat, but here's the app. You can also check it out on your phone by visiting this QR code, but it does work better on a computer or a tablet. And so this app is focused on helping people find the best hosts and nectar plants for butterflies and moths anywhere where you live in California. So I'm going to go through how I created this app and why we need it for the rest of this talk here. All right, so the data set that this app uses is called California Plants as Resources for Lepidoptera. And this is kind of a naturalist guide that was compiled by this guy named Jeffrey Caldwell, who was a restorationist and native plant gardener in the Bay Area. He's currently retired. I believe he's living in the Midwest somewhere now. But this guide details interactions between Lepidoptera, including both butterflies and moths, and their native hosting nectar plants across the entire state of California. And so what I've done here is I've digitized this data set, and we've converted it into the interaction matrices that we then use to model and analyze the sorts of interaction networks that I've been showing. And so there's really no good way to visualize such massive networks, but I'm going to attempt to do that here. And so we have two networks. We have our flower visitation network, and this is the network detailing the interactions between our adult butterflies and moths and the nectar plants that they visit as adults. And then we also have our herbivory network, and this is the network representing interactions between caterpillars and their host plants. And so these are what are called circle graphs. Again, not a great visualization, but what you see on the outside here is a continuous line of colors actually comprised of thousands of shapes that represent our insect and plant species connected through the rest of the network with lines that represent their interactions. And so between these two networks, we have thousands of plant species, thousands of butterfly and moth species, and thousands of interactions that we've recorded across the state. And through analyzing this data set, I've come up with three important considerations for more effective Lepidoptera conservation in California. Again, moving from that focus on a single species and its interactions to considering entire communities of threatened butterflies and moths. So number one, we have to be planting both our native hosts and nectar plants. Number two, we have to prioritize the most important plant species. And number three, we have to consider geographic variation in species and interactions. So I'm going to go through each one of these points. But before I get to point number one, I actually want to visit my last point here, number three, the importance of considering geographic variation. And that's because some of my results for the first 2 points rest on this. So we all know that California is a huge and very diverse state. And part of that diversity means not only a diversity in species, but a diversity in habitats and a diversity in interactions between species. And all of these things can vary with things like latitude and elevation and distance from coast. And so we can actually look to the monarch butterfly as a great example of this. There are about 15 native milkweed species scattered in slightly different regions across the state. So here the colors represent the different milkweed species. So this can give you a general idea of the variation in the ranges here. And we know that it's really important to plant local milkweed species because not doing so can actually risk confusing monarch migration patterns and also introducing harmful parasites. So it's really important to plant those milkweed species that occur naturally in your region. And now expanding this same idea to the entire community, I've taken California's ecoregions, and our ecoregions are just areas of similar climate and similar ecosystems. So here they are represented in the colors. And then anywhere that you live in one of these ecosystems, there's going to be a variety of different natural habitats that occur around you. So I gave this talk most recently at the CMPS conference, which was in San Jose. So here I'm showing some of the habitats that occur in San Jose. We have everything from mixed chaparral to different types of grasslands. And in those habitats, there are going to be plant and Lepidoptera species that occur across them. Some of those species will be localized to one habitat type. Some of those species are going to occur across many different habitat types. So what I've done is I've layered this geographic species occurrence data that I've taken from a variety of sources, including Jepson and CalFlora and Bug Guide for the insects. And I've layered that over a habitat shapefile and an ecoregion shapefile. And that allows me to actually extract these localized interaction networks for wherever you live in California and whatever type of habitat type you're trying to emulate in whatever habitat project you're working on. And so, for example, here is a network that could represent an annual grassland in the Central California foothills. All right, so just real quick reviewing how the app works. When you access the app, the first thing you'll do is input your address. You can either type it in or click on the map, and you're going to hit Find Plants. And the first thing it's going to tell you is what ecoregions you are in. So we have both the EPA level 3 and level 4 ecoregions. You can also select which type of natural habitat you want to emulate in whatever project you're working on. This is just going to search your area for those natural habitat types that occur around you. And then again, you can also, there's options here to focus on host plants, nectar plants, or both, and butterflies, moths, or both. So you have some options to play around with. The app is ultimately going to show you here is a list of priority plant species, and these are ranked based on their value to Lepidoptera. I'm going to explain exactly how this ranking works. And then when you scroll down in the application, it's also going to show you these visualizations of your local interaction networks. And so on the left here, we have our nectar plant interaction network. And on the right, we have our host plant interaction network. So you can actually see in your area, how are the plants and the Lepidoptera interacting right near you. All right, so coming back to point number one here, the importance of planting native host and nectar plants. All right, so we see a lot of emphasis on things like pollinator gardens, and these, encourage people to plant those showy flowers that adult butterflies and moths visit and bees visit for nectar. On the other side of the spectrum, we have a focus on planting Lepidoptera host plants, for example, in monarch conservation efforts. But remember, that Lepidoptera rely on native plant resources at each stage of their life cycle. And so this is a really key point here, because there's a body of research suggesting that resource use in larval and adult stages independently determine extinction risk in Lepidoptera species. And interestingly, the loss of monarch nectar plants could actually contribute more to their decline than the loss of milkweeds. And so what this is all telling us is that conservation efforts really need to consider resource dependencies at each life stage. And with this data set here, we have sort of an unprecedented opportunity to do just that, look at the interactions at our two Lepidoptera life stages here. And what I've found by analyzing this data is that caterpillars are more specialized than adults. So this is confirming a lot of previous research in other systems. In our herbivory network, we have an average of 3.6 host plants per species, whereas in the flower visitation network, we have an average of 14.7 nectar plants per species. So again, the caterpillars are more specialized. And that specialization actually makes them more sensitive to potential plant extinctions. So what we've done here is we performed extinction simulations that just remove plants from the network and test what is going to happen to the insect species that rely on those plants. And we found in these simulations that it only takes on average 1.4 plant extinctions to drive one insect extinct in the herbivory network. Whereas in the flower visitation network, it takes on average 6.5 plant extinctions to drive one insect extinct. So again, the caterpillar stage is more sensitive because of their specialization. And this is showing us that caterpillars are picky eaters. Again, 3.6 host plants per species on average. And this means that we have to be picky in choosing those host plants. And so looking at this data in a slightly different way, just to emphasize this point here, what I have here is the number of host plants on the x-axis that a certain percentage of Lepidoptera species have on the y-axis, and this is going up to 50%. And I found that 43% of Lepidoptera species in California have just one host plant species based on the available data, and a full 73% have 3 or fewer host plant species. So again, the vast majority of Lepidoptera are relatively specialized in their host plant relationships, and this emphasizes the need to find these specific host plants. But really importantly here, we've also found that Lepidoptera use discrete host and nectar plants. And so this is an NMDS plot, kind of a complicated plot here, but it's just a way to visualize complex community data. And so each point here on this plot, the axes are sort of meaningless in this context, but each point here represents a group of either host plants in blue. So this is a community of host plants, or a group of nectar plants in orange. So every orange dot is a community of nectar plants. And each dot is that community in a specific habitat and ecoregion in California. So this plot represents across all California ecoregions and habitats. And so the distance between any 2 points corresponds to how different the composition of plants are between those communities. And so the fact here that we're seeing this distinct grouping of nectar plants and on the bottom separated from this distinct grouping of host plants on the top is again showing us that Lepidoptera use significantly different hosts versus nectar plants. And this was statistically significant when analyzed with a permanova. All right, so concluding point number 1 here, while we found that the caterpillar stage is more specialized and that makes them more vulnerable to plant species loss, we also found that Lepidoptera use discrete hosts and nectar plants. And so again, while we see emphasis usually on supporting either one life stage or the other, it's really important that Lepidoptera conservation include protecting both those native host and nectar plants. And so this is from the UCR Botanical Gardens, which emphasizes this really key point here. All right, so moving on to point number 2, prioritizing the most important plant species. So we all know that California is a biodiversity hotspot. There are over 6,500 native or endemic plant species here. Of those 6,500 plants, about 1,900 are included in this data set as known Lepidoptera hosts and nectar plants. And so this still leaves us with a tremendous number of plants to choose from if our goal is to support Lepidoptera. And I really doubt that any of us are going to be planting 1,900 plants in our yards. And so this leaves us with some prioritizing to do. And I want to begin the conversation of how we prioritize plants for Lepidoptera conservation with facing an unfortunate reality. And that's the fact that we're not going to be able to save everything. So coming back to that initial figure here, 48%, half of butterfly species assessed in the US are in decline, over 200 species. We're not going to be able to save all of those 200 species. And so this brings up some really difficult and some really important questions to face, including which species should we focus on providing resources for in the context of planting native plants for Lepidoptera species. And so the way that conservation has worked traditionally in the United States is focusing on those rare, declining, or already endangered species, again, like providing milkweed for monarch butterflies. But there's growing recognition that another option perhaps is planting plants that support as many species as possible in our communities. And a really great example of that in California is Ceanothus species, which support not one or two, but hundreds of native Lepidoptera species as host and nectar plants. So here are some pictures of some of the Lepidoptera species that are hosted on Ceanothus. But I want to emphasize a point here that this question of whether to support rare, declining, or already endangered, or just as many species as possible is not necessarily black and white, and these goals are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So the way that I prioritize species in this app is coming back to an old but really important concept in ecology called the Keystone Species concept. And Keystone Species are just those species that are disproportionately important to the rest of the system, like the keystone in our Roman arch here. And so what I've found is that few plant species support the majority of Lepidoptera species. So few plant species out there are doing most of the work when it comes to supporting Lepidoptera. What I'm showing here in these graphs are the percent of plant species on the x-axis that support a certain percent of Lepidoptera species on the y-axis. And so we're going to be showing this for both our nectar plants in orange and our host plants in blue here. So these are our accumulation curves. And to get to this 90% line, 90% of Lepidoptera species supported, I've found that on average across our California ecoregions and habitats, it only takes 32% of host plant species and only 9.3 of nectar plant species. So again, 9.3 of nectar plant species and 32% of host plant species are all we need to support a full 90% of Lepidoptera species in California. And these are the plant species that are doing most of the work out there. These are our keystone species that we should be prioritizing. But we can actually take this keystone species concept a step further by using ecological network analysis, and specifically by looking at something called network modularity. So modularity is just the tendency of groups of species within networks to form compartments of more closely interacting species. So let's say that over here is our entire network in a specific habitat and ecoregion. The darker shaded regions are our network modules of more closely interacting species. And two really important roles have been proposed here. Our module hubs here in red, which are just those species that are highly connected when they're within their own modules. And then we have our module connectors, and these are species that are really good at connecting different modules to one another. And really importantly, the loss of module hubs and connectors leads to cascading extinctions across networks. So when you lose these species, you're going to lose a lot of other species because of that. Because again, these are those keystone species that are maintaining network cohesion and stability. And we can actually perform this modularity analysis at both local scales. So our local networks may represent a interaction network in a specific ecoregion and habitat. So, you know, I'm here in Riverside, maybe I want to plant like a coastal sage scrub community. Maybe this is just my network here in Riverside in a coastal sage scrub community. But we can also perform this modularity analysis at landscape scales. And this is using relatively new methodology called meta networks, which just represent how networks in different habitat types are connected through the landscape. And we can identify these what are called landscape connectors, which are species that, again, connect different habitats to one another. And in the context of conservation, this is really, really important, maintaining that connectivity across the landscape. And so when you see that priority plant species list pop up on the app, these plants are ranked based on this modularity analysis. So these are our keystone species, those species that are most important for maintaining stability across the entire community. And really importantly, this ranking method does not necessarily sacrifice our rare or already threatened species. And so I want to focus again on the monarch butterfly to emphasize this point. You may be asking, what are the blue highlights here? Well, the blue highlights actually represent plant species that support a federally or state recognized threatened or endangered Lepidoptera species. So the monarch butterfly, recently declared endangered, is now responsible for a lot of these blue highlights here. And you'll often see when you use this app that Asclepius species, or milkweed species, are often included in the top 10 plant species. And that's because although we know Asclepius as the monarch plant, milkweed species in California actually host at least 4 Lepidoptera species, including one of my favorites, the Cleo tiger moth here. And they provide nectar for 104 Lepidoptera species. So in particular, milkweed plants are super important nectar resources for many different butterflies, including our West Coast lady, again, a butterfly that's even more endangered than the monarch. All right, so concluding point number 2 here, we found that few keystone plant species support the majority of Lepidoptera species, and those are the species that we need to be prioritizing in our yards, our gardens, and other habitat projects. And we also found that community level plant ranking does not necessarily sacrifice our rare or threatened species. All right, so moving on to my last point here, the importance of considering geographic variation in species and interactions. All right, so I showed you earlier how I use California ecoregions, habitat, and species occurrence information to extract these localized networks. And what the app is doing is anywhere where you put your address in, it's going to be finding those priority plant species based only on the species and the interactions that are occurring where you live and in that habitat type. And this is really important because I've found that the identity of those top 10 plant species varies significantly between our California ecoregions. So here's another NMDS plot. This time, each dot here is representing a community of top 10 plant species. And these are colored by the ecoregion that they come from. And so each dot is a habitat from that ecoregion. And so this is a lot of data to look at. So what I did is I just summarized this by the mean and standard error here. And again, we can see this statistically significant separation between these ecoregions in the identity of those top 10 plant species. And we can see that we have some ecoregions that cluster more closely together here, which makes sense. We have the Sonoran Basin and Range and the Mojave Basin and Range here, more similar to one another than they are to the other ecoregions. And we also found this pattern within individual ecoregions. So here I'm just focusing on Southern California, which is the ecoregion that I live in. And again, we see this statistically significant separation between the identity of the top 10 plant species based on the habitat now that they're coming from. All right, and so this makes a lot of sense when we zoom in on how individual species importance varies across the landscape. So what I'm showing in this figure here is going to be the California ecoregion on the x-axis, organized roughly from north to south. And then on the y-axis, we have a metric that I call plant importance, and this is just on a scale of 0 to 1, and it's calculated from that modularity analysis. And so I'm going to plot individual plant species up here. First, we have yarrow, Achillea millefolium, and we can see that yarrow is consistently a pretty good Lepidoptera plant. It's usually in the top end of this 0 to 1 scale here, but we do see that it varies significantly in importance across these California ecoregions, and it seems to peak in the Central Basin and Range. Now we're going to see a different pattern for each species that I add to this figure. Here we have our narrow-leaf milkweed. This one appears to get more important in the southern end of its range. Again, varying significantly between these ecoregions and how important it is. Now we have chamise, Denistona fasciculatum, which gets less important in the southern end of its range. And then again, a different pattern for California mugwort. And another thing again that we're seeing here is that not only are these species varying in how important they are between California ecoregions on the x-axis, but they also vary in relation to one another and how important they are across the landscape. So in general, California mugwort is not a really great Lepidoptera plant. I'm not saying don't plant it for other reasons. It's a really great medicinal plant, but not the best host or nectar plant for Lepidoptera. All right, so concluding this section, the identity of those top 10 plant species for Lepidoptera varies significantly between our California ecoregions and habitats, and the importance of individual plant species for Lepidoptera varies significantly throughout the landscape as well. So what I want to do with this data set in the future is look at climate change projections. So the current communities that we're looking at here are based on their current range and the data that we have. But one thing we know about species ranges with climate change is that they're shifting, often northward and often upward in elevation. And so what I want to do is couple this sort of network analysis with species distribution modeling in order to determine what those future communities might look like and which plants may be the most important in maintaining that climate change resiliency in the future. All right, so concluding this talk here, I want to circle back to our friend, the monarch butterfly. I presented some distressing news in the beginning here that in 2020, the Western monarch population, which overwinters here in California, had declined by over 99% since the 1980s. But there is some good news in this story. In 2021, that population actually rebounded by over 100-fold. Over 200,000 individuals were counted in 2021. And a lot of this success has been attributed to milkweed planting efforts. So these sorts of efforts really can make a difference. But I hope I've shown you here today that the monarch butterfly is not the only species that's at risk. And with the butterfly net, we can all start planting the best hosts and nectar plants to support entire communities of threatened butterflies and moths in California. All right, so before I take questions, I do want to mention really quick that the butterfly net is a work in progress. There are errors in this data set. There are over 16,000 interactions that we've recorded to make this app, and errors slip in. There's also errors in the geographic species occurrence information. So if you see an error, if you see a plant species that doesn't belong, please email me, report those errors. There are also links on the website that you can use to submit anonymous questions and comments. All right, so thanks everyone for listening. I do want to thank everyone who's helped me so much on this project, including my PI, Nicole Rafferty, and the rest of the Rafferty lab. Thank you so much to Jeffrey Caldwell for this amazing data set that's allowed me to do this research. I've been partnering with Andrea Williams and Jessica Woodard from CNPS and Calscape to integrate this technology into their online systems. So keep a lookout for that. And of course, all of my amazing undergraduates who have helped me along the way. Thanks, everyone, and I can take any questions.
Chris, that was amazing. That was really, I mean, that app is phenomenal. Can you share your screen again and just put the QR code up again quickly? I didn't quite get it, and I'm too lazy to type out the whole URL. There are a few questions in the chat, and I think at this point also, if people want to unmute themselves, let me see, they're back here. There was see if I can scroll back far enough. Are you from Judy Fennerty, are you counting milkweed as one species or 17?
Yeah, great question. I think the last time I checked in this data set, we have at least 10 of the species represented. Perhaps more than that. It really depends on that geographic species occurrence information. So if there's not good data for that, then it's not really going to show up in the app. But yeah, definitely not just clustered in under one species. It is really important to use your local milkweed species.
All right. Yeah. Here's what plants would you suggest for common urban garden where the actual habitat cannot be determined? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go on. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So yeah, like part of the challenge here, like you said, is like you may not know what habitat you want to emulate. And that's sort of a limitation of the way I've created this app, where you kind of have to select a habitat type. So I would recommend, just like thinking of the closest habitat type to what you're trying to emulate there. And you can just, scroll through the different habitats that show up to find plants that you may like and that may be relevant to your area. I can't really give specific recommendations unless I know exactly where you live. That's sort of one of the points here, is that we need to be providing these localized plant recommendations based on your exact location.
Can you see the chat now? Just to that way you can see the questions. But there was a follow-up about the number of milkweed species. It was specifically about the slide that shows how caterpillars only use very few plants. So in that analysis.
Yeah, sorry, I don't see the exact question. I do see the chat, but there's so many comments.
7:55 p.m. Does that help? Anyway, that's what it says. It says my question was specifically about the slide that shows how caterpillars only use very few plants. It might be hard to remember exactly what that point was at this point.
Yeah, well, the point of that slide was basically that like caterpillars are host plant specialists. They're ecological specialists, meaning on average, what my data has shown is any given Lepidoptera species is only going to have like maybe 3 potential host plants. For the monarch butterfly, we say that they're a specialist, but really monarchs can eat any milkweed species, and there are dozens of milkweed species. So are they really an ecological specialist? Well, they're a specialist on a certain lineage of plants. But one thing that we're learning more and more is that it's really important to, again, choose those local milkweed varieties. Not only because if you plant, for example, tropical milkweed, you can introduce pests and pathogens. But again, you can risk confusing monarch migration patterns when they're flying over an area that has milkweed in bloom when it naturally should not be in bloom. That's going to make them think that they're in an area that they're not in. So that's sort of one of the issues there.
There's a hand raised, but there's also, let me just get this one question in the chat. Are there risks of planting cultivars of native plants? Most nurseries only have Ceanothus, Joyce Coulter, Ceanothus, Yankee Point, etc.
Yeah, that I don't really have a definitive answer to that. I've seen a little bit of research recently. Doug Ptolemy has actually done some research about this, and it's a mixed bag. I've seen some studies showing that cultivars are like downright bad. I've seen some studies showing that they're no different. I really think it probably depends on the plant species. So
And the
sorry, I don't
cultivar.
have a great answer there.
Yeah, well, okay, great, thanks. Penelope, do you want to unmute yourself and
Hi, yes. Great talk, Chris. I'm Penelope. I'm an undergraduate at Occidental College, and I'm currently studying and researching about green roofs. And when you mentioned the connectivity, it really reminded me of some of the papers I was reading. But I was wondering, in terms of the research you're doing, if you have seen anything or have any thoughts on green roofs promoting biodiversity, specifically with the Lepidoptera, and just any thoughts you had on that?
Yeah, well, something that you've probably encountered in your research too is that in the world that we're living in, where our landscapes are just so degraded, it's really important, again, to use any amount of land that we have access to right now. And for the average person, that's going to mean, yards, gardens, and the green roof idea, I think, is a great idea. Converting something that provided no habitat to something that can actually support insects. I think there's also a lot of research out there showing that cities, which were historically viewed as like these depauperate areas that can't support any wildlife, are actually now probably one of our best hopes for providing insect habitat. So I think green roofs are a great idea. Again, make sure you're planting the right plants in the right places. I think that's a really key idea that more and more research is pointing to, that idea of like hyperlocality. Not, native to California does not mean native to, Riverside. You really have to look at which species belong here, exactly where I live.
Great, thank you.
there's a question that got sent just to me in the chat. Other insect groups such as bees are in decline also. How does your system apply to or incorporate those also? Or does your system apply to or incorporate those also?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because that is on the agenda to incorporate new taxonomic groups of insects, and also expand to new geographic areas. So this tool is right now localized to California. And the reason behind that, the reason it's only Lepidoptera right now, it's only California, is because one of the things that you absolutely need for a tool like this is the interaction data. And those data sets are really rare and hard to come by. I was lucky enough to stumble upon this data set, again, that has 16,000 interactions between butterflies, moths, and native plants in California. Unprecedented data set, but those data sets just really don't exist for most taxonomic groups and in other parts of the country and the world. So there's a lot of recognition right now of that fact. I see a lot of effort by organizations like the Xerxes Society, for example, to really ramp up these interaction databases, because that's the future of conservation, is not looking at species, it's looking at interactions, because interactions are what sustain ecosystems. I'll be adding the bees soon, specifically for the Bay Area, because that's the only data set I've found so far. But if anyone is aware of bee plant interaction data, I need it, and I can basically feed it into the same framework that my app uses to get bee plant recommendations out there as well.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and shout it out.
Hi, this is Lawrence. I have a question. Do you see a danger of prioritizing interactions and eventually losing the Endangered Species Act, and then this being an excuse to develop and destroy habitat on a greater level?
Yeah, that's that is a loaded question. There's a lot of, there's a lot of debate in the conservation community and the scientific community of, how effective have things like the Endangered Species Act been? How effective is, the milkweed campaign? Are we even going to be able to save the monarch butterfly? I'm not pretending to have these answers, but I really think that we're entering sort of a new and somewhat uncharted territory when it comes to conservation. And we're kind of forced to address questions like that. Should we be focusing on species that are, it's depressing to say that, but a lot of these species are kind of destined for extinction already. So is it wasting resources by throwing all the limited resources that we have for conservation at those species that are already super endangered? I don't have a great answer for that. Again, I don't pretend to have an answer, and I don't know if we'll have an answer anytime soon. But I think the point.
I actually have an answer to that. I would disagree and say the answer is no. And I heard the same debate when I'm an old retired biologist and ecologist, and I heard the same debate about saving the condor. It was the exact same debate. Why are we going to put all this resources into saving one bird just because it's bigger than a lot of other birds that are going extinct? But, saving any of these species saves a lot of other species. So I think we need to fight like hell to maintain the Endangered Species Act and also do what you're suggesting in addition to it.
Absolutely. I'm not advocating for getting rid of the only legislation that we have to protect, species. So by no means am I advocating for getting rid of the Endangered Species Act. I think the hope, again, is that the Endangered Species Act does serve that purpose in, serving as umbrella species and supporting habitat that's going to support many other species. And in the case of the monarch, that's something really hopeful about the data that I've analyzed, is that milkweed plants are really important, not only for the monarch, but for a lot of different Lepidoptera and a lot of different other insects, wasps and bees as well. So yeah, thanks for the ideas there. I want to get more involved in that debate, and I hear a different perspective from everyone I talk to about it. So thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic presentation.
Other questions? Well, okay, great. Thank you, Chris. That was.
I have
Okay.
a question. Steve McCabe, really enjoyed the presentation. I think it's a great project, giving people lots of ideas of things that they can plant and strategies they can use. I'm fortunate enough to, live in sandhills habitat. One thing sometimes folks forget is if they're in a rare habitat, sometimes, for me, one of the most satisfying things is when I pull the weeds and then something native to the site comes up. And I've been really pleased, the silverleaf manzanita is supposed to need fire to sprout, and the ceanothus is supposed to need fire to sprout, but, got rid of a non-native plant pine that was there before me. And, some of these natives are coming up, got rid of acacias that had been planted before I was there. So it's really satisfying when people do have that opportunity. They're not in the middle of an urban environment to pull the weeds and see what comes up in your yard. But really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate your feedback. Thanks.
Anyone else want to ask or contribute? All right, I think we can let Chris go then. Thank you, Chris. We will have the recording up as soon as we can get the ends chopped off of it and whatnot. Let's see, there's a comment. A lot of the research you cite suggests that as restoration practitioners, it is really important to be collecting locally. I think we can just sort of probably say yes.
I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
I'll send you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you the chat so you can see all the love. And I think everybody probably is really looking forward to playing around with your app. So
I'm glad to hear it. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me again, and thanks everyone for coming.
thank you, Chris. See you around campus.
Yep. Bye.